I'm very pleased to see people here, people I know and known for many years, obviously, and then there are new people, and it's lovely that this is such a live and changing group. It's great, and it's lovely to see everyone here and these record numbers. So some of you, what I'm saying will be a bit repetitive. I don't ever give exactly the same talk. I can't bear to do that, so I try and refresh it all the time, bring in new ideas. What I'm going to talk about today is the numerous separations that the boarding school children suffer. Because this plays out in therapy. For those of you who are therapists or who are in therapy, you will recognise this. Oh, and this is just to let you know that I've published some books on boarding schools, just in case you didn't know. A bit of self-publicity, but also The Dying Patient in Psychotherapy is a book that's very close to my heart, because it's a book that I wrote because way back in the early 90s, in 1990 I think it was, a patient came to me. He was referred for depression. And within 2 weeks of starting therapy, he had poured out the story of how he was sent to boarding school at 8 years old. And he made such a powerful connection with me. It was the first time he'd ever told anyone what it was like, and it was absolutely awful. And I became completely attached to him, really, and really engaged with the work. And unfortunately, about 3 months after he came to see me, he had a terminal diagnosis. And we worked together for 2 years until he died. And after he died, and he knew I was going to do this, I asked his permission if I could write about our journey together. And he agreed to that. And so that book is a very detailed account, both of someone who becomes ill in psychotherapy, but also of the profound effects of boarding school syndrome. So this is the person who led me to consider this was an issue, at which point somebody said to me, I think somebody's doing something about that. So I vaguely heard of Nick, but didn't know anything about him. Then I started writing the book, and I thought, who is this person? So, as one did in those days, you didn't Google anything. I phoned up the bookshop, Carnax, and said, has anyone written anything about this? Because I'm writing this book. He said, oh yes, you want to look at Nick Duffel's The Making of Them. So I did that, and then made contact with Nick, and since then we did lots of work together in different ways, and Nick started a training for psychotherapists, specialist training for psychotherapists in boarding schools. And I worked with him for a while on that, and still do a bit. So that's how I came to it. I wasn't a boarder myself. I had a very narrow escape. I was taken to look at Rodin, but my mother wasn't having it. And nor was my father, because my father was a boarder. He went at 6 and had his head put down the toilet straight away. So I grew up with that, but I didn't realise that all this work is about analysing my father. It probably isn't totally, but growing up with a boarding school father is also, we talk about partners. But boarding school parents are difficult too. Ex-boarder. So, I came up with this term, boarding school syndrome. It came out of the work that we were all doing, really, because I felt that we needed to recognise, along with Nick, who wrote The Making of Them, which there's some classic phrases in this whole world. And so this came out of the work we were all doing. I started writing the book. I originally wrote an article in 2011, and I can remember thinking, I wanted to call it boarding school syndrome, but I thought, can you do that? And I remember speaking to my sister at Lake. I used to talk to her a lot about my writing and stuff. I said, can I actually do this? And I thought I was going to get such a backlash from it. But we published it, and far from a backlash, it was taken up by the media. And psychotherapy journals, articles don't usually get taken up by the media because it was a thing. And there were people who recognised it. And ever since then, people have written to me, as they do to Nick and Alex Winton and anyone who speaks out about it, really. And masses of people write to us about how affected they were by boarding school. And it still goes on and on. Because more people are realising that it wasn't just them. So, for me, I felt my colleagues and I needed to know, psychotherapy colleagues, needed to know that this was a thing. And that's why it needed a name. And so, people would talk about an ex-boarder in therapy and supervision or something without realising that this actually meant something, that this person was traumatised, multiply traumatised, actually. So this was the reason for it, in a way, for writing it down, so that we could talk about it, so that people who thought they were the only one in the world knew that they weren't. And because, of course, this is often seen as a privilege. You know, you're very lucky, you can't complain if you went to boarding school, because, you know, you must be very wealthy, which often people aren't, or you come from a tradition of boarding schools. And of course there's such a mix. There are people who come from families where it's a huge tradition. There are other people whose parents are in the military and many, many other things. So therapists need to recognise that this is a multiple trauma. And they didn't. They would ask, take us history, and someone would say they went to boarding school and it was treated like, well, they went to grammar school or any other school. So we needed to be able to talk about it. And the ex-boarders needed to know they weren't the only ones. So we needed a theory. And one of the things that, in that very first article, I made the link between boarding school and children in the care of the local authority. In institutional care, I think we need to be clear, because children in individual care, again, get a better deal. But often the children in the care of the local authority are from a deprived background. And then I realised that boarder is also a child in care, but they're usually from a privileged home. And the children are raised, in both cases, the children are raised by strangers, and they're raised without love. So in psychotherapy, we find that well, I think I've already said this, that the thing about boarding school is often missed. Even now, and many people who I've spoken to have had psychotherapy, like Nick or Simon as well, who have had psychotherapy, sometimes psychoanalysis, for many years. And the one thing that wasn't touched on was their boarding school experience. It was left, and as Nick put it in his book, you know, it was like it was something that you didn't mention, so the therapist wasn't interested, so he didn't talk about it. He's made up for it in later years. When there are breaks in psychotherapy, when you're working with somebody who went to boarding school, it's surprising how easy they are. Other people kick up and make a fuss, but often the boarder doesn't make a fuss at all, because they're apparently unmoved by breaks. They've had so many ruptures in their lives that actually, the therapist going on holiday, well, I was getting attached, but actually it is no big deal. And so they may not appear to care about disruptions, but then suddenly, after the break, they don't come back, or they send a message to say, I'm fine now, or they come once and they say, actually, I'm really better now. And so keeping the ex-boarder in therapy is a real skill, because they're really all right. I mean, I just do it for a bit, but actually staying with it and staying with the pain of what it means to be multiply traumatised is a big deal. So, I wrote the book, and this was sort of in the book, but not brought out in this way. I realised that there was an A, B, C, D, and then an E, A, B, C, and then a D of boarding school syndrome. These are the multiple traumas. So the person is first of all abandoned, then they're bereaved. Homesickness is what we sometimes call it, but actually no, it's a bereavement, a multiple bereavement. Captivity. And then finally, in desperation, this becomes disassociation. So then there's captivity. The child is captive. A child in a boarding school is captive. They're imprisoned. Lots of people have made jokes about it. Huge number of comedians actually are. Oh, we've got one today. But a huge number of comedians are. If you listen to Desert Island Discs, it's fascinating to hear who went to boarding school and how many comedians went to boarding school, because, of course, one of the ways of surviving is to be the comedian in the class, because then you may not be bullied. Or if you are bullied, you can make a joke of it, and then you become integrated rather than totally ostracized. And finally, the child gives up and we get disassociation. So I want to go into these traumas in depth. So the first trauma is abandonment. The moment of abandonment is shocking. And very many people remember it in all kinds of ways. I mean, a lot of people who write about it, like Roald Dahl, describes, the moment of kind of his mother just going away and leaving him with the headmaster, standing in this huge space because he's a tiny boy. And other people describe not seeing their parents leave. They're told, could you just go and get something from upstairs, or go back to the dormitory for something? And then when they come back, their parents actually aren't there anymore. So all sorts of ways of leaving your child, which are totally inhuman and terribly, terribly painful, bewildering for the child. And that moment is usually etched in the memory of each person. So in therapy, that's a good question to ask. Do you remember the first day? And we often do ask that, but maybe not go in depth into it yet. But just here, do you remember it? I mean, I had one person in particular who couldn't remember it at all. Never did. We worked together for a long time. Never remembered the day he arrived in the boarding school. Couldn't get it. But children soon realise they're alone and they're exiled from home. And this is, now I have got permission to show these pictures. They're the pictures from my book, Boarding School Syndrome, just a few of them. Because this is someone I work with, not the dying patient, somebody else. Because after I realised that, I started to be much more alert to working with ex-boarders. If someone came along, and then when I published the article, people started coming to me because they were ex-boarders and knew something was wrong. But quite often it's just someone comes with depression. So this person had 2 years of therapy with somebody else who had identified with him that boarding school might have troubled him a bit, having gone at 7 years old. But this is the moment of abandonment. Now, he is somebody who was very able to use drawing as a medium. He wasn't an artist, but drawing just came naturally to him, and I'm an art therapist, so it actually he was describing being left at boarding school, and I said, could you draw that? And I had a pad and some felt tip pens beside the patient's chair in my room. So he picked them up and drew. And this is his memory of the day he was abandoned, the entrance to the school, where he suffered repeated abandonments. Because I remember last year, Thurstein had actually counted how many times he'd been left at boarding school. It's not just the one. And a lot of people say it's the second term that's the worst, because you realise it's going to go on. It's not just going to stop. So just to go into the depth of what actually the child loses at this point, they don't just lose their parents, they lose everything. They lose their family, their nanny if they had one, their siblings, their friends, their toys, their pets, and familiar day-to-day activities. They lose the parental love and care if they had it, and they certainly had some kind of love and care. in most families, even if it was fairly dysfunctional, because I'm not pretending home's ideal. It's just a lot better than boarding school generally. Not always. There are one or two people I know who say, look, school was better for me than boarding school. And someone who said, at least I knew where the punishment was coming from at school. So let's not pretend homes are ideal. But generally, it's familiar. So many people never saw their nannies again because at 7 they went off to school and nanny's not needed anymore, so bye, you know. And nobody thought, for most people, nobody thought, hang on, this is a person that actually the child is attached to. Like, we know a lot about attachment theory now because of Jeremy Holmes, John Bowlby, but actually Freud and Jung as well. I mean, everyone knows that children need to be attached to adults, and that grows from infancy. So, if it's the nanny the child is attached to, you're not supposed to be attached to your nanny. And if the nanny is an ayah in India or somebody in Africa, a woman from the local community, the child may not even have that first language. Their first language may be the language of their carer, the ayah, the nanny, and it may not be English. So they've got the multiple loss there of losing that language too, the language of comfort often. Simple play relationships. Boarding school, everything's regimented. Most boarding schools don't give children time for reverie. Some people now say they, you know, I always get in and out of the bath. Don't lie in the bath and rest, because we had 3 minutes at school and then the next girl came in. And so you learn not to rest and relax, and so you lose simple play relationships. I know I'm talking to people who know this stuff, I think, but this is written for all of us, really, to understand the nature of this trauma, because you may know it, but actually it's the depth of it. Therapists need to know, we all need to know, because of this wound. So simple play relationships, siblings, you know, and toys. Taking your toy to boarding school is hazardous because it may be all right, and you may have comfort from your teddy bear. I remember last year, Thurstein showing his teddy bear. I thought that was wonderful, and some of you will have been here then. You know, he's had it all those years. It was his comfort. But some people take their toy and it's sliced up immediately or torn apart. There's envy and jealousy. And of course, what the child loses is its habits. Familiar day-to-day activity, their bed. I mean, your bed is your place of refuge, and this guy who did the drawing, he said the bed wasn't the same. You go to bed and you know it's not a comfort. It's a place to hide sometimes, or worse. Because let's not forget sexual abuse. I'm not talking about sexual abuse today mainly, but my goodness, that on top of all these traumas is an extra devastating trauma. And yeah, I can get quite angry about this still. A sense of place, a sense of belonging, the smells that you're used to, the food you're used to, everything, it's all gone. So that child is bereaved and they're exiled. So it's an unspeakable wound because a child of 8 can't say actually anything really. They don't have the words for it. What we do as parents is we help children process the feelings that they can't manage to begin with. And I mean, that's what Peter Fonagy calls mentalization, but we've done it, all therapy is that really. We teach people words for what they're feeling, and that's what parents do with children. A little child, when it's a baby, you see the parent sort of looking at the baby and making noises, and the baby is crying or something, and the parent says, I think you've got a tummy ache, or your nappy needs changing, or are you hungry? The baby can't talk, but the baby is communicating, and the attuned parent picks that up. And not all parents are attuned, but the ones that are, you know, that works. And so the baby grows and develops a language. That goes on. So when you're 8 years old, it's a bit different, but still, the parents explain things in the world. Like you've got a tummy ache and you don't want to go to school tomorrow. Well, okay, that's maybe what's the case, but maybe let's just try this. What, do you think you might be anxious about something tomorrow? What's happening in, this or that? The parent processes it, helps the child to process it, and say, well, maybe go to school and see how you feel when you get there. And you can always phone me, which you can do if you're not in a boarding school. If you're in a boarding school, there's no one to do that. There's no one to help you process stuff. You're a stranger and you've lost your home. And homesickness. I mean, one of the things that happened to the guy I wrote about in The Dying Patient, who I call James, he ran a race. He was 8 years old. He was left at boarding school, taken there, very exciting, getting ready to go. When he got there, he became ill. He ran a race very early on, and he was the smallest child there, and he won it. And it was like, fantastic, I've won. And he looked round to see who was there to celebrate. And his parents weren't there, no one was there. And he knew even then that he got ill because he wanted his parents to come and get him. But the school phoned up his parents and said, he's not very well, but he'll be fine. That was it, they never came. So the child gives up hope. A few of these incidents are repeated, the child gives up hope. So the state of exile is repeated, and the child is exiled both in the outer world, they're emotionally homeless, they're exiled, and the homeless state may remain in the adult as a perpetual sense of exile. So many boarders say things like, they don't have a sense of home, or they're going home to their wife or whatever in their adult life, but when they get there, it's disappointing because it wasn't actually the fantasy's home. And there's something about not being able to meet up and be at home, not being able to be in an intimate relationship. So there may be a wife or a husband there, but there isn't, or a partner, but there isn't the intimacy, the intimate connection, because it's too difficult to trust anyone that you love, because they may leave you, and it's better not to trust them and not to let go of your feelings, because if you really depend on someone, they could take to boarding school. So, and of course for children from abroad, it's an additional pain. And in the previous generations, it was often colonial parents that sent their children home, people in the military or the diplomatic, working for the government or something like that, and they'd send their children home from abroad. Sometimes they'd come with them and sometimes they wouldn't. Sometimes they'd put them on a plane or send someone else with them, or just send them, or take them and leave them. But the point is, they came from a different place in the world, and often it was from a hot and colourful country. And when they arrived in the UK, in the autumn, in the grey autumn, they would then have to wear clothes. They had to wear winter coats and shoes, and so their freedom was curtailed. Many people who grew up in hot countries had the freedom to run around, not wearing very much, of course, because it was hot, bare feet, whatever, and suddenly they were constrained in that way. Another form of captivity. So the children are strangers in a strange land, whether they come from abroad or not, and they're in the care of strangers, and they're often emotionally neglected, because however good the house parents are, they've got too many people in their care. So they cannot give any one child that attention that they need. Unless, of course, they're a paedophile, and then they're awfully good at it. I won't go into too much detail about that. I mean, Alex Renton talked about it, the scale of that last time he was there. But of course, that is what the children are vulnerable to. I am going into it. The children are exposed because they're neglected, because they're alone. If there is someone there who's a predator, then it's very easy to groom the children. And it's another talk, really. But this is what they're exposed to, and bullying from other children, and the comfort found in the arms of other children when you're really scared. And there's other comfort at night. There's people in the dormitory, and that can just be for a cuddle, but then the cuddle turns into something else, and then the older child abuses the younger child. So, and people say schools are better now, and I think, hopefully they are. Safeguarding is a bit better. And, duvets and toys are generally safer, and the staff are generally safer, but you can't protect children 24 hours a day from other children. So there's all sorts of ways they're exposed and neglected. So it's the weird thing about this is, it strikes me, parents, they warn their children about stranger danger. They tell people, you mustn't talk to a stranger, never take sweets from a stranger, all that stuff. And then they leave them with total strangers. I mean, they've met that headmaster once, twice, and they think, oh, I've heard they're very good, and they seem jolly nice. And then when they've gone, they're not really nice at all. Bereavement. So the child is bereaved. Now, we often use the term homesickness. And yeah, it's true, the child is sick because he misses home, as I was just talking about. But bereavement's a bit more than that. It's the loss of everything. These children are bereaved. So the first reaction, I went to Colin Murray Parkes and looked at actually what he says about bereavement. And of course the first reaction when somebody dies is shock, and then alarm, and then terror. Well, not everyone when they die that's the case, but for the child it is alarm and terror. So it's shocking. As said, he had all sorts of horrible things he suffered, but towards the end of his therapy he said the worst thing was that his mother left him there. Mothers just don't do that. But she did, and yours did, those of you who went to school. And however, they're often well-meaning, or they do it because the husband thinks it's the tradition in the family. There's many reasons, and you can talk about that later, but it's that thing about the abandonment is the most profound violation, I think, of a relationship that should be, I want to say sacred, but I don't really, that's not a good word, but should be sacrosanct in some way. That, and let's not idealise mothers, but let's not, many of these mothers that we are talking about left in tears. They left their children and they were in bits, and they lent on the siblings at home, if there were any siblings at home. Some of them turned to drink, others had a lovely time and played golf. So, there are some of those, but not all, and many mothers regret it, and sometimes they come to me and talk to me about that, and that is so courageous, because again, some of you in this group will be mothers or fathers of children who went to boarding school probably, because there was a reason that had to happen, or because it was what we do in our family. And sometimes, you can't help it, that's what you do. You feel you'd be depriving your child otherwise. A lot of people feel that if it's a family tradition. And other people have great aspirations for their children. But anyway, whatever the reason is, if the mothers listen to themselves when they feel so wretched about it, they wouldn't do it. If you feel that bad, imagine how the child feels, and fight your husband's father or whoever it is wants to send them to school. But mothers didn't have that power, and a lot of mothers went along with it, and fathers with the tradition. But it's often mothers that are the ones that didn't really want to send them, but they did. So the first reaction is shock, then the loss dawns, then gradually the tears don't bring the person back, and the crying, and at boarding school you get bullied for crying. Because, of course, if you cry, then I'm going to cry. And we could all be in tears, and that wouldn't be good, because we're all little people, little men, little women, who've got to be strong. There's hope of rescue to begin with, and there's despair crying, which crying used to get a reaction, but it doesn't here. You know, pack it away, dear. You know, it'll be all right. You're just homesick. And then this morning, a phase where actually we realise actually the parents aren't here and they're not coming back. And there's anger with the parents, anger, maybe not with the parents, just anger because you're such a bad person, otherwise why would they have left you here? So that's guilt, and that stays with many, many people. Many adults that I work with feel responsible because if I had not been a bad person, they wouldn't have sent me away. And I was a bad person because, Nick talks about that double bind, that if you, my parents think it's good for me, but actually it doesn't feel good, so I must be bad because you're a child and my parents think it's good. So the child is grieving, they're bereft, at night crying alone. They anticipate the return home, but of course they don't go home because when the parents come to visit, they're left again. So I've said about this really, there's no one in whom to confide, so the child learns not to speak. There's no one to help process, give them a language for their feelings. I wrote a paper called Lost for Words in Therapy Today, which was all about how there are no words for those feelings. So the child grows into a child or an adult with often intellectual abilities. Sometimes the education is quite good in schools. Some girls' schools particularly, the education was appalling. Some boys' schools as well, but the child develops with an intellectual ability but a lack of emotional language. Right, containers and packing, the trunk. So one of the things that people remember is packing to go to school, preparing for the bereavement really, getting ready. Of course it's very exciting sometimes, you know, the child's going away to school and for the first time it's like the privileged child, the eldest child, the boy in the family, whatever the role is, this child is going off to this special experience because they're grown up and they're 8 years old and grown up. And so that the excitement's great, but then when you get there, like I talked about with James, the loss hits you and you've no idea what it's like. So you fill this trunk, a container, with everything you've got to have to keep you going for the next 3 months. And then that's what you've got. But anyway, it often gets pulled apart by other people. And the tuck box, the same, taking treats from home. Can it last the term? Do other children rip them out and steal them? And so this is a drawing by someone I call Rose, who was 11 when she went to boarding school. And she remembered her trunk, getting the trunk ready, and she drew it. And so this is the container with a big lock on it. And she went to school, it was taken up to the dormitory, you unpacked it, that was it for the term. Then the trunk was taken away. And the beginning of the holidays, just when they're going home, they used to bring the trunk up to the dormitory, and that was really exciting because so the trunk symbolized so much. And this is a drawing of her when she was packed away that she made. So you see the little girl with the innocent little face in her school uniform and her teddy bear right at the front of the picture. And then at the top, the circle, she said was her pajama case, which had 2 little mice on it. But I think the 2 little mice were her and her sister, because she had a little sister who she loved very much and had to leave when she was 2 years younger. And she lost her sister, she left home. And her sister came to the school later and she did everything she could to look after her. But, the siblings is really important. So the trunk symbolises repetition of the trauma and of abandonment. So the first term abandonments traumatic. The second term is worse because of the inevitability, and the child is powerless. Repeated ruptures each term, and holidays are overshadowed by the inevitable return to school, and you don't feel the same when you get home. The child is actually lost to their parents. Many people felt their parents didn't know them once they'd been at school, especially if people were sexually abused and couldn't talk about it. But anyway, whatever the abuse was, maybe it wasn't even abuse, it was just being there away from home. Couldn't be talked about. So this packing business causes problems in adult life with packing, going away from home, or partners going away. And often the person has no idea that this is why they get so irate about or struggle so much with these packing events until we get into this boarding school thing. My father was unbelievable when we went on holiday, the rages he used to get into over packing. And then I don't know if he ever realised that was why, because I didn't until long after I could be his therapist. Another thing is food. And so one of the things that happens, Mary's here, Mary wrote this article, which I often quote, because she wrote Mary Sack, who wrote an article on the dining table, and how arriving at school, the terror of this crazy, the foreign food and this terrible cacophony of children talking. And of course it was like the Wild West for some children. Their food was snatched from their plates. The best food was, one of my interviewees for my book said, she was quite little, and so the good food was snatched from her plate, and sometimes swapped for the rubbish that the other person didn't want, the older girls. And then people being forced to finish unpalatable food. And this permanently impacts relationships with food in later life. And girls in particular used to learn to not ask for food. One of the things table manners were taught to girls, I don't know if they still are, I think it's, we're talking now about mixed schools, and things are different, and the abuse is different in the peer group, that is, because of course there are boys and girls together. I'm not going into that, but today people have mobile phones, they see their parents more often, they're still abandoned, they're still living without their parents. But girls learn not to ask for food. So if you wanted the butter and it was over there, you might turn to your neighbour and say, would you like some butter? And if she said no, then you didn't get any butter, because she didn't, unless she said to you, no, but would you like some? So they were learning these manners, but she was much too scared. She doesn't now drink coffee with milk in it. She was much too scared to ask them to pass the milk. So it creates a denial of desire, and I think that's very important too. And especially for girls, a lot of girls' manners were to train them to sort of be unsexual, to wear thick knickers. That was one of the things. 2 pairs of knickers very often in girls' schools. So later relationships with food are affected, eating disorders, eating fast, no time to savour and enjoy it, a total denial of desires, or not even an awareness that you have them, because nobody turns to you and actually says, how are you feeling about this, or, what do you want, or no kind of emotional connection. And of course the implications for sex and other intimate relationships are really, tied up in this. In my book I talk about girls who were abused by being kind of measured up to see if their breasts were big enough for to wear a bra, and if so they had to wear the regulation bra. Menstruation, the terror of menstruation for those girls who didn't have it explained to them before they went to the school. And then then this thing about repetition. So this child was abandoned, and he originally by being left at the school. Then his parents came and took him out, and the food was terrible in the school, really awful. They used to have to eat stale bread and gristly meat. It was just vile. And So his parents took him out for a very rich meal and gave him a present and brought him back to the school. So he had a nice day out with his parents, but he was sick because the food was too rich for him. And then he got back to the school and there was nobody there. He was the first one back. And there were children, so he walked around the school and thought, well, and just went to bed. And when he drew this, he was actually really in touch with the feelings. And he wrote, "Help me." And then he wrote, "God help me." And he was feeling it. And that's the difficulty with therapy. This was I'm a very courageous person, actually, to go into all this with me through the drawings. And the drawings really help because they bring forward stuff that you can't speak or cognitively, you don't know it cognitively, it just emerges out of just beginning to draw. And that's what he did. And but he was traumatized in the room very often. And one of the things that's really difficult is how to help the person find the adult person that they still are and leave your room after a certain, after their therapy. And it's very hard for the person to manage it. He managed it with huge strength of will that he learnt at school. He shut it away again at the end of the session. But he would bring it back. And sometimes he would look at the pictures, he'd forgotten what he'd drawn, and he'd look at it and go, really shocked, but the pictures held it, and they stayed in my room. I didn't let him take them until the very end of therapy. They stayed in my room, and I looked after them for him. So that's symbolically really important because it's part of holding the person and holding them in mind. So captivity, the child wears a uniform, they must bath, eat and sleep at prescribed times, and they can't leave without parole, and there's no space for reverie. So, back to Rose. Rose had a dormitory in an attic room where she could see right out, and she was in a town, which is quite unusual, I think, and she could see right out across the town, and there were day girls at her school, so she could see people going home to their homes, and then at night she could see the lit up windows and families having their supper, getting on with the evening things that families do. And so she could see into these windows, and she used to look out of the windows and yearn to be at home. So one day there was a sports day at the school, and Rose and another little friend, these girls were 11, noticed the gates were open. They just thought, well, let's go. And they walked out, not really knowing where they were going, not having planned it or thought it through, and walked down the street into the town. And then they kept walking. They thought they'd go home, so they just kept walking. And they walked along a dark country lane. And it was getting a bit dark and a bit scary. And then a police car arrived and said, "Where are you two going?" And the friend said, before Rose could invent something a bit more interesting, said, "We're running away." And so the police car said, "Well, come and join us, we'll take you, we'll look after you," basically. So they took them to the police station and phoned the school. And they showed them the cells. And they said, "If you do this again, this is where you're going to end up. So you don't want to do this again." So, okay, so this is imprisonment. So she got the message. And the school headmistress came and got her. And she was taken back to school, the two of them were taken back to school, and they'd ruined the sports day for everybody else, because of course everyone was searching for them. And so the girls sent them to Coventry, didn't talk to them. Some people won't know what sent to Coventry means, perhaps, but that's a very schooly thing to happen. They didn't talk to them at all. So these girls weren't talked to. And the parents, as far as Rose knows, her parents weren't contacted. But the other girl told her parents she wasn't sent back at the end of that next term. The following term, she was kept away. So the impulse is thwarted, the child is not allowed to escape, and disassociation comes, the threat of a prison cell. The spontaneity, because this was a very spontaneous thing they did, was punished, and so was the initiative. So she learned depression compliance, to be institutionalised, not to play, and a loss of self. All of that had to be repressed in order to live in that prison. And that's the repetition. The same thing happens. Boarding school, home, all the time, the repetition. And that is soul murder, really, that split. Unable to express emotion, a split occurs. A part of the self remains inaccessible, and disassociation takes place. And that's what we're dealing with adults in therapy, or with yourselves, really, some of you. The feeling of unreality, of not being present in their own life, living in a bubble. This is depersonalization, is one of the things. This is the bit I wanted to just say. This business of the split, the term times, the boarding school self, and the home self, the split between the two, continues into adult life and often impinges on relationships. Like a lot of men in a marriage, for example, will be in the marriage, apparently very conventional, really working very well, but he's got a boyfriend on the side that he keeps somewhere else, or a girlfriend, or he visits sex workers, and that is the split learned at boarding school. So you don't invest too much in one person. You keep your options open. One person described it as women are for love and men are for sex. Well, you learned that at boarding school. Anyway, I'm going to stop there. Good. Go on.